Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. If this is your first episode of Behavioral Grooves that you've ever listened to, welcome. And we're here to tease out the why we do what we do out of all sorts of things in order to improve our work and home lives. And if you're a regular listener, please accept our gratitude for listening.
We are glad that you're hanging out with us. And in case you didn't know this, I'm not sure how, we are coming up on our 100th episode. So we had a big celebration in Philadelphia last week, and we got to hang out with a bunch of our listeners in the same room, which was super cool.
Yeah.
We rarely get to sit down and have in-person conversations with the community of folks who listen to Behavioral Grooves, so it was particularly fun for us.
We also had 3 super cool guests.
Woo!
We had Annie Duke, Jeff Chrysler, and Michael Halsworth on stage for the event and the 100th episode. It was, it's going to be fabulous because, we've already had it. We experienced it. We recorded it. It's going to be a great episode. So we want you to check that out. This also is a good time to reiterate our gratitude for our event sponsors, People Science and Podbean.
Absolutely. We are very grateful for their support. And in addition to being excited about our 100th episode, we're excited about this one, our 95th episode.
Absolutely. We are very excited about this because we got to reunite with an old friend of mine, Dr. Victoria Shaffer, who's a psychology researcher based at the University of Missouri, to discuss some of her latest research on decision-making under end-of-life conditions. And it got very personal. Victoria and I met more than 10 years ago when she was researching how work performance changes under a variety of incentive reward conditions, and it was really fun catching up with her recently.
Yeah, so we started the talk with some of that old work that you and her had done about hedonic rewards compared to cash rewards. But then we quickly shifted into more of Victoria's recent work, which is focused on the decisions we make in severe health circumstances, such as elderly care, or more specifically, how she and her family navigated the decisions around the end-of-life care for her father. It is a touching conversation that is both personal, and yet it provides a really clear lens in which we can see why we do what we do in these types of situations.
Yeah, and on a personal basis, we greatly appreciate Victoria's openness to discuss this and are amazed at the insights that she was able to draw and share with us. With that, sit back, relax, and listen to our very interesting conversation with Dr. Victoria Shaffer. Victoria Shaffer, welcome to the Behavioral Grooves podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, it's so good to see you. Oh my gosh. Okay, we're going to start with a little speed round.
All right.
Okay.
All right. So, bike or unicycle? Which would you prefer?
Bike.
Which would you prefer to give up for the rest of your life? A phone or a laptop?
Phone.
All right. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Which makes a better reward, cash or a hedonic luxury?
Hedonic luxury.
All right.
Oh, that was a tee up.
It was a tee up. So this goes back to some of your earliest research. Can you tell us a little bit about why that is the case and under what circumstances cash is outpaced by something that's not cash?
Sure. So this goes back to my dissertation. And this is something that I was interested in when I was at Ohio State many years ago. But one of the things that I noticed reading through the literature was that, it goes back to this principle that a lot of people in general, don't understand what they're best motivated by. Mm-hmm. So, we choose one thing, but often the optimal choice is another thing. And so if we think about this in the context of performance and motivating performance and providing incentives, it would be rational to say, hey, let's ask the employee, what would they like to have? What kind of rewards would be most rewarding to them? And when you do that, people say, oh, I'd like to have cash every time, hands down. However, when you look at performance relative to the different kinds of incentives you could provide, people generally underperform when you give them cash relative to something fun that they wouldn't buy for themselves, like a spa trip or a gift card to a luxurious restaurant or something of that nature. So I've generally been interested in this principle of we don't have a lot of great insight into the things that motivate and affect our behavior. And that was one really interesting example to me for a while.
Why is that? Why don't we have a better insight into our own motivations?
I don't know that we know the why for sure. There was a paper by Shelley Taylor many years ago that I thought was really interesting, which suggested that a lot of these biases we have a self-serving purpose. And so one of the things that kind of goes along with this is that we tend to be very overconfident in our abilities. And so this is one of the things that we don't have really good insight into our true abilities in a lot of things. And we tend to think we're better at driving, at, any kind of skill we can think of, shooting a basket, right? We're all above average is how we view ourselves. And in this paper, she talked about how folks with clinical depression actually tend to have much more accurate perceptions about what they're capable of. And so there's been some thought that maybe some of this is just kind of a self-protective mechanism, that it would be really depressing to know exactly all of these true things about our nature and ourselves. So I don't know that anybody knows per se, but that seems to be how we're wired.
That's an interesting component. I need to research up on that. But the fact that the more realistic you are about your abilities and different things is correlated to
depression.
Psychological depression.
Yeah, at least in this interesting paper. So
that's fascinating. So, well, I know that you haven't been necessarily working on cash versus non-cash for most of your career. What have you been? What is some of the more recent work that you're doing? Because you're doing some really cool stuff with some end-of-life care from what we've talked about.
Yeah, so I transitioned from this more business-related work to medical decision-making, but the same principles are at play, and that's what I think is interesting to me, these underlying principles about how we make decisions for ourselves and how we don't often have insight into the best mechanisms for making these decisions, or we don't know what's the most useful piece of information. So a lot of the psychological mechanisms are the same across my topics of interest, but I slowly shifted over towards an interest in medical decision-making. My advisor in graduate school, who I did the dissertation research with, also did work in medical decision-making. And I really liked the applied application. The idea that
was Hal Arkus, by the way?
Yeah, Hal Arkus.
Yeah.
And so as I kind of came into my own as a researcher, I ended up looking at more of those kinds of choices that I thought had really important real-world impacts. And it seems like that was a place where decision psychologists hadn't been in these medical decisions. So there's a lot of other spaces of decision-making in marketing and business and whatnot that decision psychology has historically been a strong part of. And medicine, it was a place where it seemed like, we could really fill some gaps in what I saw to be some of the issues with medical decision-making. So have a longstanding interest in that concept. And then more recently, so I've been helping create decision support tools for patients who are making decisions around cancer care, and decision support tools for physicians who are helping to support patients who are making decisions. Cancer has been one place that I've operated one context for a while.
And can you give us an example of what a decision support tool is?
Yeah. Thanks for letting me clarify that, because I just threw some jargon right at you. So there are a lot of decisions in the medical field that are what decision psychologists call preference sensitive. So that means there isn't a single medical treatment option that it clearly wins. There are actually multiple treatment options that are very similar in terms of their clinical outcomes, and they have very different pros and cons to individual patients. And so in that case, the doctor can't say, hey, here's the best treatment, you should just have that. Rather, they typically say, hey, here are 3 treatments. They are fairly equivalent in their effectiveness, but they each have different harms and benefits. And it's really up to you as the patient to figure out what best suits your needs, your interests, your preferences. And so that's a really hard thing to do. That's been a big shift in how we ask patients to make decisions in the last 20 years, from being the person who just does what the doctor asks to being the person who has to make the decision with all of this complicated information being thrown at them. So broadly, decision support tools are created for that context, when there's a real choice that the patient has to make. And it helps them kind of get up to speed with the physicians. It gives them the information about the data that we know, whether it exists or not, if there's uncertainty in the data. It tries to present statistical information the best way possible, so we know better now about how to communicate risk in a way that is more understandable to patients. And so we use a lot of those premises and tools to construct often it's an online form, but it used to be paper-based, but something that patients can have that can help them be informed before they try to make these difficult choices.
Are there cultural differences in these decision tools? Or maybe let me ask it this way: are there cultural differences in the way that these decisions are made, between patients and physicians?
Yes, I don't. It's not an area that I spend a lot of time operating in, but for sure, some of the research that I have read suggests that that's very much the case. Generally, the U.S. is now we've sort of shifted over the last 20 years to be a place where the patient wants to take the lead in decision making. But even within the U.S., there are age differences in that. So many older adults, that has not historically been the way they operated with their physician. And it feels very uncomfortable to them to change that. So even in the context of the U.S. environment, there are a number of differences in how patients really want, whether they want to be the decision maker or not. But absolutely, there are cultural differences. There's a book by Atul Gawande called Being Mortal, and his family is from India, and he describes how in that particular cultural setting, you actually don't generally even tell the patient the prognosis. You tell the family members, they make decisions, they do stuff, and the patient's kind of kept in the dark. And so, there clearly are, different ways to approach decision-making in medicine across the globe, but even within the U.S. as well.
So you mentioned this up at the beginning, like that you're really studying how people don't understand what they're motivated by or some of the outcome components of this. And so these decision support tools, are you using those to help people to better understand how their long-term satisfaction with the outcome, how are they being utilized from that perspective? Is that part of it?
Yeah, so there's a couple of basic pieces. I think one first premise is when you're first diagnosed with something, and we can just take cancer as an example, there's an information gap between you and the physician. And so a large part of this is simply informational, right? How can we present the knowledge that a patient needs to get up to speed? This physician has all this history and knowledge. And so can we winnow it down to critical elements that a patient needs to be informed about? And then beyond that, we also know that there are a number of psychological processes that come into play that can bias our decisions. So one in particular that I've been interested in is affective forecasting. And so we make affective forecasting errors, and that, again, is a more general phenomenon, which means that we are pretty poor at predicting how we'll feel in a future state. And that applies to medical decisions as well. So a lot of times, we have to make a choice between treatment A and treatment B, and we heard what the side effects are, but it's really hard for us to imagine how we're going to feel experiencing those side effects. And so one of the more controversial aspects of a decision aid, but that I've been interested in exploring, is providing stories from other patients that can help try to fill in that gap. So here's some experiential information. So in addition to what is it like to experience, say, when you have radiation or chemotherapy, sometimes you get sores in your mouth, right? And so it's one thing to say to somebody, you could get sores in your mouth, and another thing for another patient to say, I couldn't eat anything, it hurt so bad, I couldn't move my mouth, I could only mumble. That's what it feels like to have sores in my mouth, right? And so a lot of times there's this disconnect between how we would describe the concept of a side effect or something you might live with, and then what it feels like to have that. So I think that's one element where decision aids can also help with these psychological challenges to making decisions. And we're still working on that. I'm interested personally in narratives and testing whether in the long run they do improve people's ability to forecast these future health behaviors. But
you said that there's some controversy over adding those patient narratives as part of this. What's the controversy part? Because it seems pretty straightforward to me. I mean, as I'm listening to you, I'm going, I would want to understand what, mouth soreness, what it really impacts, right? And I think it goes back into, some of the components of, as you said, we're not good at forecasting what that affective component, and just understanding how other people have experienced things is a better predictor than our own kind of judgment out on that most of the time. So,
yes, I think the controversy comes in when you have to pick stories. So whose story gets chosen, and is that representative of the experiences? If sometimes we end up choosing a really severe side effect because we want people to understand it, but it's something that's really unlikely to occur. And when we do that, we can actually make people feel like experiencing that side effect is more likely than it actually is. And so we can mess with how people perceive the risk of things by what stories we tell them, where in the, if you can think of the distribution of possible experiences, where do you select from that distribution? Usually you only have time in a decision aid for a couple of stories, and then it becomes, whose story? And then that's where people start to argue, right? Well, if you give them that story, they're never going to want to choose X treatment because all they're going to hear about is this 1% side effect and it's going to really scare them, whereas 99% of people don't get that. And that's so there's a lot of concern about bias when you talk about stories. So if you have a health state where there's more of a uniform experience, it's a lot easier. Like uniformly, people experience X, it hurts, or this is what it's like. My favorite example is childbirth, right? Every birth story is unique. So is it helpful for me when I was pregnant to hear every other woman's birth story? Probably not, because that for sure is not going to happen to me. So that's where it comes in. It's like, when do you share stories? When are they helpful? When can they be harmful and biasing? And we're kind of sketching that out.
Interesting.
So, there's a lot of trouble. A lot of challenges, I suppose, in trying to help patients and physicians in this decision process, right? There really are some big challenges that go along with. Well, actually, you're enumerating the problems. What other issues do you see with this, or what are the core issues that you see with it?
Yeah, I think all of it relates to framing effects and information presentation effects and bias. And so with the narratives, it's really easy to see how bias can be introduced by which story you select. But there are other elements of sharing information that feel much more objective, but can also be equally biasing. So for example, if we think about how we present probabilistic information, if I say something has a 10% chance of occurring, that actually feels less risky to people than if I say a 1 in 10 chance of occurring or a 10 in 100 chance of occurring. Because if I say a 10 in 100 chance of occurring, you're like, wow, there's 10 people that had that thing that sounds so scary. And 10% actually feels less scary. But mathematically, these are equivalent. And so even, in how we choose to talk about risk, we can introduce bias or change how people feel about something. And it's unclear what's the right presentation, right? What's the right way somebody should feel about it? Should you feel like a 1 out of 10 risk, or should you feel like a 10% risk? What best maps on? And so then also things like order, like the order effects of information. What do you present first? What do you present last? We know that has an influence on how people make decisions. And again, so these are things that feel less obvious, to people, but all of these things kind of come into play when you're trying to communicate information. You want to be unbiased about it. You want to say, here's the fair, here's everything, you choose. But every decision you make about how you present it has some slant to it. And some are more obvious than others.
It's interesting to me that you said that, this decision science part hasn't been part of this medical kind of world, because it seems that the question, like what you were just talking about, are really important components of how that doctor-patient interaction is. And I'm pretty sure that most doctors are not thinking about this in this way. And so, and they want to be able to do this, but those are big issues of, life and death or health and various different things versus, are you selling a candy bar for 28 cents or, $1.50, whatever that would be. So,
yeah,
right.
It's
So
interesting
my analogy probably is not the best there, but all right.
But it is interesting because the psychological principles I'm talking about have been around for a long time, information effects, right? Yeah. So it's not that we're learning kind of new things per se, but it's, this is a place where it really matters and we should really be thinking about it. Peter Ubel, I don't know if he's a physician who you know of. He dabbles in more than dabbles. He does a lot of behavioral economics, and he's at Duke. And he wrote a book called Critical Decisions. And he is particularly critical about the medical school curriculum and how it does not, it has all of this very deep focus on pathology and biology and, all of those kind of neurocellular level sorts of things, and practically no focus on risk communication, relationships. How do you have a hard conversation? He describes when people are first asked to give bad news, it's often like, oh, hey, here's the intern, your turn. Go good luck, go give somebody this bad news that they're dying and see how it goes, and it's sort of trial by fire. Yeah. And so there really is, it is a place where we could be doing so much better because we know a lot of great information. And it's just about making it into part of this culture.
So when you're talking to physicians, I'm curious about two conversations. One is when you see this with patients, what kind of effects do you see? How do they respond? And what about physicians? I remember you did a study on defaults with physicians, and as I recall. When the default was to have all of the tests checked, the physicians were more likely to prescribe more tests. And yet they said, no. That couldn't be me because I'm a physician. I'm a professional in this realm, and you can't tell me that I would prescribe more just because you defaulted to all of them.
It turns out physicians are human too, and somehow that was missed for a really long time. So all expertise doesn't override a lot of these basic biases that we talk about, and I think that might be surprising to people that we haven't really gotten into that. That we're still human, and even if you have great clinical expertise, these things like the default, still meaningfully matter. So in that study, this was a great study by a PhD student of mine. This is his dissertation. And he created an electronic medical record interface mock-up. So it was designed to look like the interface of this medical record in a Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City. And so he was interested in how we could influence what orders physicians put in. Mm-hmm. And so he created 3 different conditions. One was just sort of the status quo. You need to just check the things that you want to order. One, as Tim mentioned, was everything was pre-selected, so you had to uncheck it. And then the third was we got a panel of experts on a few different disease topics. And we said, what would be the recommended tests and orders that you would place for a patient who was suspected to have, X particular illness? And so then there would be meaningful defaults that were selected. And so you would think, from a sort of neoclassical economics perspective, it shouldn't matter if everything was checked or nothing was checked, that you should have an idea of the optimal order set and you should do that or not do that. But when we checked everything, I'm trying to remember the exact number. I want to say it was like 2 to 3 tests on average more that were ordered per fictitious patient. So we had these little mock cases that a physician would read and then go through and make orders for patients based on this description of information, much like you would in an emergency room situation. Yep. So there were more tests that were ordered, but that wasn't necessarily a good thing because they weren't necessarily the recommended tests. And so, our argument was that the best version of this was the third condition that had the recommended test pre-selected, because they didn't order statistically more tests than the control condition who had no pre-selected ones, but they were more likely to choose the ones that the experts deemed to be appropriate. So you get less bloating and cost, and you get more accurate choice. But again, these are physicians who have really great expertise, and these are just not things that you can keep in your brain all the time. You are going to be influenced, particularly when you're working on the fly, by all these heuristics that we all are influenced by.
So do they? If physicians are humans too, and I guess they really are, do they take to these ideas and suggestions and the work that you're doing with open arms and, oh my gosh, we're so glad to be trying something different and to improve the relationships that we have with our clients and improve the decision making, or is there some resistance?
Generally, I think physicians want to do that. Their goal is not to harm their patients at all whatsoever, right? I think the challenge is, how do we do that? And does that change the way they're doing things and, change the way they operate with the environment or their patients? And so sometimes when changes are suggested and they have to change their clinical workflow or work around something, a lot of times these changes make life more difficult. And so that's when I think people get really irritated. Is this really helpful? Do I have to actually rework my whole clinical workflow to get this in there? And so, for example, if you take the idea of the pre-selected defaults that are informed, that takes a lot of effort to develop a national panel. People are going to be lobbying about which of these things should be pre-selected because they're more likely to be chosen. Mm-hmm. The American College of Radiologists will have we really want anything with X-rays to be pre-selected, right? So when you actually get into the nuts and bolts of it, it's a challenging thing to do. So you have to have, for the example of the pre-selected defaults, there have to be best choices there, and there's not always best choices. And then what happens when you don't have a clear-cut clinical case? Which defaults apply and who gets to choose the defaults, right? So those are all, again, it's in the details. I think physicians are open to the concept of improving decision-making for sure. But then it's like, how do we actually put this into play? And that's where I found things to be much more difficult. When you have things like decision aids, if it takes, people are concerned it's going to make the visit take longer, we're going to have all this discussion. And so those are the kinds of things where people start to get a little, uninterested in these new advances.
So relative to the patient, is the patient more open, different? How did the patients respond to these relative to the doctors?
I think patients generally are excited about this. Again, I think there are individual differences in preference for involvement in decision-making. And so part of the way the field has tried to understand this concept of shared decision-making, which is, these decisions are now shared between a physician and a patient. So this is a dyadic decision versus a unilateral one, is they want to assess with patients, how much do you want to be involved? And more often than not, patients really do want to be involved, and they like taking ownership of their choices. So broadly, this is something that is well received for patients.
Let's get back to end of life stuff, the stuff that you're working on now, Victoria. Can you share with the listeners a little bit about what you're working on right now?
Yeah, so I am really interested in how to promote advanced care planning and discussions about patients' preferences at the end of life. This was a particularly sort of personal shift for me in a research agenda. In December of 2017, my father was diagnosed with stage 4 oral cancer. And it was an interesting, at the time I thought, oh gosh, I can help. Like, this is the thing I can, as a daughter, like, I don't have a lot of skills that are going to be helpful to aging parents, but this one, I can do. And so I can help them sift through the literature. I can help them understand all of these, the data. I can help them understand, all of these kinds of things that are going to be confusing and overwhelming. And then when we got into it, I realized I was actually not very helpful at all. And there's still a lot that we need to be able to do. So for example, pretty quickly, because the cancer was so advanced when my dad was diagnosed, he had to make some treatment decisions, and we did not have very much time to do that. And so one of the things that we had to make our decisions based on was physicians' best judgments about the chances that my dad would survive given the different treatment options. And while there was some data that existed, so he had stage 4 oral cancer in a 5-year timeline for survival, only 25% of patients survived. And so in his was clearly pretty aggressive, because in a few months it had gone from a toothache to it had, sort of gone through in his jaw, and there was bone involvement. So we had to make decisions. The first one was pretty easy. He needed to have his jaw replaced, and he felt like that was a straightforward, yes, it hurts, I'm ready to do that. But after that, we had to make a decision once he healed from, so they took a bone out, they removed his jaw, they took a bone out of his leg and implanted that into his face. And it was this whole 14-hour procedure. And so he had to recover from that. Yeah, it was really tough for, just the surgery alone was a big deal. And then after he recovered from that, it's about 6 weeks later, he had to make a choice about whether he wanted to undergo chemotherapy and radiation. And so the surgery alone was not going to be enough, particularly because when they went in, they realized that his lymph nodes, it had already spread to his lymph nodes. One lymph node had actually, there was evidence that it had gone past that lymph node as well. And so it was probably, circulating. And so they were pretty certain that if he wanted to have any chance of surviving, he would have to have chemotherapy and radiation. And so in my read of the literature, it was a really depressing read, because it didn't seem to have a huge benefit. And in fact, so the survival rate, was not very much larger in the group that underwent chemotherapy and radiation. But in fact, it was a really, really painful, course of illness. So this was going to be concurrent chemotherapy and radiation for 6 weeks. And when you have radiation to the face, it has a whole lot of other additional things. And so, I could read and bring to the table this information, but what we couldn't figure out was, how likely was my dad to survive, given this additional, sort of treatment. So we had to make these trade-offs of, do you want to endure this really difficult, painful procedure? And if so, what's the likelihood that you would survive afterwards? And so, we asked the radiation oncologist at the hospital here, and he said, first, nobody ever volunteered this information. So to me, this is the thing I want to know, but no one volunteers it. And so I said, what do you think my dad's chances of survival are? Were you going to say something?
Well, I got to ask, why wasn't that volunteered? Why wasn't
that
seems like, doesn't that seem like sort of a natural, like, okay, let's talk about the odds here?
You would think so, but physicians are very reluctant to discuss prognosis. And part of it is because they're going to be wrong. It is a probabilistic judgment. And people, and it comes back to bite them a lot when they get real specific. And so I think that's part of it. But there's a real reluctance to give bad information. And there's a perception that patients want hope and want people to be positive. Mm-hmm. And so when you have bad news to give, you're diminishing those things. And so there's a real bias towards either overestimating survival or not even discussing it at all. So I had to ask in each situation, what do you think his chances of survival are? And so the first radiation oncologist at first asked my dad, do you want to know? Because I'm not just going to answer her question. I want to know if you wanted to hear this. And he said, okay, okay. And he said, I don't think it's very high, single digits, maybe 8% at the most. So he would go through 6 weeks of chemotherapy and radiation concurrently for an 8% chance of survival. He for sure wasn't going to survive without it, but he only had an 8% in his perception. But then, so my dad started thinking, maybe I don't want to do this. I don't know if it's worth it. Because it's I think the chemotherapy and the radiation were worse than the surgery. Because when you have radiation to the face, you just get this 2nd and 3rd degree burn all over here, and it can take your parietal gland as well. So you have difficulty. Your salivary glands get destroyed, and so you can't swallow. And there's a whole eating becomes a problem. A lot of people need a feeding tube, and it's a huge quality of life thing that no one wanted to talk about. Again, that was the other thing that no one was talking about. What does it feel like to have chemotherapy and radiation? And so I kept asking these questions that I just felt like should for sure be on the table, So my dad, after having this initial conversation, was thinking he might want to forgo this. And his surgeon then heard about it. And she said, well, I think your chance of survival with chemotherapy and radiation is like 40 to 50%. Like, I think you need to go for this. I don't think you should not do this. And so it was like, oh, who's right? How do we evaluate this?
That sounds really troublesome to have
these two competing doctors.
Yeah. And then we went to a second opinion. So I went down to MD Anderson Cancer Center, and they have a slightly different version of radiation that they're promoting. And the physician there, radiation oncologist there, thought my dad was more likely 60% chance of survival. And so again, it's how do you evaluate, right? Who is going to be correct? And which place do you do treatment then? And so what really troubled me was that there was no basis for making this decision. There was no data to support any of their, prognostic estimates. And so, I could only look at the data in the literature, which suggested that he was probably more in line with the first 8% guy. And I could only look at the data on prognostic information in the literature, which suggests that physicians tend to actually double their estimates. So not necessarily consciously, but they give twice as long prognostic estimates than people actually live for, or twice as long chance than people actually have. So I know that physicians naturally are more positive than is accurate. And I know that, the 5-year survival rate with stage 4 cancer is 25%, and even less with all the characteristics that my father had with the idea that it had spread already. But that was the only thing I could offer. I don't know how else to help him choose between these competing opinions and these different facilities
So were you willing to be more dismissive of MD Anderson's 60% and the surgeon's 40 to 50%? Were you could you step back sort of objectively and say, no, actually the literature is really leading us in a different direction?
Well, it's interesting. So this is what decision psychologists struggle with. There's this trade-off between the sort of epidemiological literature, the population, and then the individual patient sitting in front of you. So I would say, well, why are you so positive given the literature suggests that, the base rate of survival is just even base rate, not considering his pathological history with respect to the, cancer spreading. Why are you so positive? And they said, well, he's in really good health. Everybody else who has oral cancer tends to be drinkers and smokers, and he was never any of those things. And, so they each had these really individual reasons. And again, there's no data to support that. The vast majority of people who have oral cancer are heavy drinkers and smokers, or have HPV. And so, he did not. So does that mean he was actually going to be better off? Or maybe it was worse because, it
was a different component.
It developed an absence of these risk factors. And so that was really tough. Even when I pushed back a little bit, they had reasons that sounded reasonable. And I knew probably, just from the larger literature, probably were not accurate in the sense of, I know people tend to overestimate. And so this is probably still represented in overestimation and just a justification of the overestimation. But I had no reason for saying you're wrong,
So your experience in this, given your background and your history, and like you said, when you started this, it's like, oh, I have something to offer here because you have this background in this. I would estimate that 99.5% of the rest of the population isn't going to be even thinking about some of these things that you're doing, and so they're just going with that first component. So what is some of the research so what did you come out of this, and how is it being applied in what you're doing now?
Well, I came out of this first thinking we need to be collecting more data. So for all of the people we interacted with, they had judgments that they were giving, and they presumably did this for every patient that asked on a regular basis all the time. And they were not writing down their predictions, right? And they weren't writing down, so one thing that you could do as a physician is say, okay, I said 10% for this person and these reasons, these are the characteristics of that person that made me think that. Let's record that. Let's record that for every patient that comes through, then I can make a decision. And let me see the base rate of success in my own patients. Let me see, how does that, fit relative to patients that, in the larger population. And so there's a lot of data that each individual physician could be keeping that could allow them to make a more informed. It doesn't have to be from the gut. And people aren't willing to, that's not part of our culture in medicine right now, is to keep these kinds of judgments as part of the data, right? Because physicians also tend to think of this as providing patients hope. So if I give them the more positive number, there's even some conscious upward skew as well, which is I want to give my patients hope, and patients want hope, and they don't want me to be totally, most pessimistic, worst case scenario guy. They want me to be best case scenario guy. So I think we can do better, not changing anything, but collecting more data. But that definitely goes against the culture of physicians, again, being hope givers and life givers and not being, sort of particularly accurate or right on the nose.
Well, it goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning with, the depressive, people with depression have a more realistic view of their abilities and different things. And to that component, offering hope is, allowing these people, potentially, it might be not as realistic, but is that quality of life at the end with that, feeling of hope better than not? And I get those are judgment calls, I would suppose, and probably some of the stuff that you're looking into.
Yeah. And so it was just a real, personally, it was a real frustrating place to be in. And I should tell you how the story ends. So that we can kind of step through the consequences of that. So my dad ended up choosing to go to MD Anderson, where he got the most positive prognosis. And so he did 6 weeks of chemotherapy and radiation. They had to move down there, and I flew down, every other week. And he got really, really sick. He lost 30 pounds. He couldn't talk by the end. It hurt too much. When we drove him home, back to Missouri, he was just probably the worst I'd ever seen him in terms of his quality of life. And he was really miserable. He was taking fentanyl and all kinds of opioids, to just make it through the day. And so, he got through that. And then 6 weeks later, he called me. It was in June. So he got finished his treatment mid-April. First week in June, he called me. My mom had gone out for the first time to a book club with her friends. It was the first night she had left him. And he said he thought he was having a heart attack because he was having really bad chest pain and back pain. And so we got him and we took him to the emergency room. And it turned out that the cancer had recurred and it actually fractured his back. And that was the intense pain that he had. So it recurred so quickly and spread and grew a tumor so large that it fractured a vertebrae, which was the thing that was causing him this intense pain. So 6 weeks later, it had returned with such intensity that it had already fractured his spine. And then at that point in time, there just wasn't anything left to do. So he died 2 months after the cancer recurred. And I really struggled with, did he have to go through all of that? He went through all of this chemotherapy and radiation, and it was absolutely miserable for him. And then he died 2 months later, and if he had gotten more accurate prognosis, would he have gone through that? And we can never know, we can never know if those individual point estimates were accurate because, the person said 60%, maybe he was one of the 40%. But without data, I think we'll never be able to make better informed choices. And so that's part of my frustration. I was able to kind of emotionally move past that because my dad made his own decision. He felt like at the end, he was like, hey, I weighed the choices and this is what I chose. And I don't regret it. And everyone tried their best and wanted to give me the best quality of life. And this is just the roll of the dice, for me right now. Yeah. So I don't think there was any resentment there, but I did struggle a little bit to think, I don't know that he needed to go through that. And so that's definitely, it has encouraged me to think more about, let's have these conversations. How can we promote having these conversations where we talk about prognosis, where we talk about what is the course of the disease? We don't wait for patients to ask. We have these things earlier. We ask people to think about how they're going to feel, so that the choices, don't occur too late. So as the one thing that I could do, as the daughter of somebody who studies medical decision-making, I know that people tend not to have these conversations about what their preferences are until the very, very end. And it makes it difficult because oftentimes when those conversations need to occur, the patient's now non-responsive and they can't make the decisions. And so the family member has to come alongside and make them for them. So the one piece that I knew is that we needed to have these conversations, when you get to the point of, we have to make choices for your health. What choices do you want me to make? What are guiding principles that are important to you? And so part of my research now is trying to promote this advanced care planning earlier in the course of the disease.
Is this tantamount to medical directives that people, at least in the U.S., fill out pretty regularly to say, if I get to this point, please do this?
That's a great question, and I dislike the advanced directives. So I think that's a really good clarification, is that I don't think advanced directives are the solution. I think this is more of a conversation about goals. And so the reason I think that is that advanced directives are very specific. I don't know if you've had the occasion to fill one out, but they ask you, if your heart stops, do you want to have CPR? If your heart stops, do you want to have, and there's sort of this list of very specific things. And the challenge is that most of the time, the choices that a family member has to make for a patient, or choices that has to be made when they can't speak for themselves, are not ones that you've discussed. And so the advanced directives are very specific, and they really require you to, again, affective forecasting is a problem here. You don't know what you're often going to want until you want it. So what can we do instead? And what I'm advocating for is not new to me, but there are a group of researchers that are advocating for goals of care discussions instead. So you have these regular ongoing goals that you say, what are your goals for your treatment? So we'll never be able to walk through all of your very specific choices that we'll have to make. But if I know your broad overarching goals, I can make decisions based on that. So for example, with my father, the two goals for his treatment that he identified were, one, he didn't want to place extra burden on my mom. And number two is that he wanted, towards the end, he wanted pain relief to be the most important thing. Earlier, he was willing to trade off any kind of life extending measure for more pain. But towards the end, he said, at this point, I just want to be as pain-free as possible. So when he became unresponsive, we had to make some choices about what would make him more comfortable. And we were able to kind of go back to those, particularly guiding principles. So, for example, when towards the end, his cognitive function was diminished and he was confused and he didn't know what was happening. And so the hospice nurse came in and she said, "Do you want to put in a catheter? It's going to be uncomfortable. He's going to be scared, but I think he's really uncomfortable. I think he has to go to the bathroom, but doesn't know how anymore. And this will make him more comfortable. But it's going to be a little bit of a challenge to do this." And so my mom and I said, okay, well, let's think about those guiding principles, right? What was important to him? Well, one is discomfort. While it might cause him more discomfort in the moment, I think he's going to feel better. And then two, this will make it easier for you because, she was having to clean up a lot of incontinence issues. And so this would fit both of those things. And so we decided to go ahead and do that. And that was sort of how I think these things can operate. We never had a specific conversation about whether he wanted to have a catheter at any point in time. But you need those principles to kind of guide that. So I think that's very different than an advanced directive, which is very specifically oriented and is going to, I think, bring up more issues than it's actually going to be helpful. But the goals of care are more, again, around these broad guidelines and then identifying the person who you want to implement those for you when you're not able to communicate.
So, Victoria, you talked about how those goals kind of changed as your father was going through this.
Yeah.
Have you looked at before people even get a disease? Is there any benefit for people who are healthy at this point to start saying, well, at some point I may end up in a situation like this, and here's the types of goals? Or is that so distant, so far removed from what is actually happening that it doesn't really have any relevance once that actual disease, whether it's cancer or heart disease or whatever else is coming into the equation?
Yeah, that's a tough one because that's where people who are not proponents of goals of care discussions would say, you're never going to know. You need to have just-in-time decision-making. If we do anything in advance, you're going to be making predictions for yourself that may not be accurate once you actually get there. And I think I would push back and say there is value to having an ongoing, regular series of conversations. So this can't be a single decision that you make when you're healthy and 20. And then when you're 80, people are, saying, hey, she said she never wanted wanted a CPR or wanted all the things. So clearly there's evidence that we do change over the course of age and illness about what our preferences are. And I think the best process would be, an ongoing relationship with your care provider who routinely asks you to kind of update and share how you're feeling about these kind of trade-offs that you would make. I think there is danger in thinking you can do an advanced directive one time and then it solves all of our problems, because there is real issue with affective forecasting. And then there's also experience, for a lot of people when they get cancer the first time, they're willing to do a lot of heroic things. And then later they go, I can't do that again. I can't do that anymore, and it changes. I don't know if that's an affective forecasting error or if people are really willing to try it one time, but then not again. There's clearly a change over time and what we think is important and what we want that needs to be captured there. So there that is the danger.
It sounds like it's more. This is like more than one study. I mean, there's a whole body of research that needs to be developed here.
Yeah, and I think so. If I could outline kind of the pieces that I think need to be done, folks have done research on prognostic information. So how well do physicians, predict how long you have left to live and what are your chances of living? And physicians are pretty poor prognostic indicators, but we know that they are biased in a particular direction, which is they tend to suggest you have more life to live or are more likely to survive than you actually will. So what can we do to improve prognostic estimates, right? Those are pieces of information that decision makers probably want to have. So I think kind of the first input is what can we do? Are there algorithms that we can use? And there are better prognostic algorithms that can be used and brought to bear in the process. And then how do you communicate about it, right? When do you start talking about prognosis? When do you talk about the side effects? How do you talk about the side effects? How do you talk about risk of the side effects? How do you present information? So beyond decision tools, on a conversation level, can we train physicians, primary care, palliative care, oncology, cardiology, to present information in a way that's most understandable to patients. And then having these ongoing discussions about preferences with the idea that they should be frequent, they should be updated, they should be part of your regular care plan. And that's where I'm spending my time right now is, can we promote goals of care discussions earlier in the course of illness? And so there's been a lot of difficulty in implementing those kinds of protocols in the non-primary sector, in the sort of specific specialty clinics like cancer and cardiology and whatnot. Those folks are really reluctant to have deep dives on goals of care. And so I've been thinking about, where could we put that then? And the primary care relationship is one that I think is probably the most fruitful for having these goals of care. So you've got a relationship with, ideally you would have a primary care provider for a long period of time. Even when you go off to see oncology and cardiology, you return to your primary care, and they can be the person that facilitates these conversations. So some of the work that I've focused on the last couple of years is developing interventions to promote advanced care planning in primary care setting, identifying people who have life-limiting illnesses, not necessarily that folks are going to die in the next year or two, but that have these disease courses that will limit their life. When can we start having conversations? Can we kind of prompt or nudge, right, using some behavioral economics terms, primary care providers to begin the conversation? Because I also think it's a process, right? We talked about this a little bit, but just even, we haven't talked too much about how patients feel about having these discussions. And there's not a ton of data, but in my own personal caregiving experience, patients tend to be reluctant to have them. So they're not often going to be the person who says, I think I'm going to die, let's start having this conversation. And so there needs to be a time to allow that to develop and into, a fruitful discussion. For my dad's example, I had pushed him to get into a palliative care facility after he was diagnosed, which is earlier. Usually palliative care comes later in the course. But I knew that the palliative care physicians would be really good at thinking about quality of life. And so when he went for the first time to see the palliative care physician, he started asking him about his goals of care. What are going to be important to you as the disease progresses? What do you know about your prognosis? What do you want us to know about how, what your preferences are? And my dad got really upset, and he was, why are you asking me this? I'm not going to die tomorrow. I'm not going to die next week. This is way too soon. And I remember thinking to myself, gosh, if anybody should be having a goals of care discussion, it's somebody who has stage 4 cancer. This is very appropriate. This is not inappropriate. And he's a smart man. He had a PhD in psychology. It was clearly not an issue of not understanding the situation, but it was an issue of not wanting to understand the situation. So he was just like, no, we're not doing this right now. But then the next time he came in, he said, so I thought about what you asked me last time, and I've been thinking, and so it was like this kind of.
He had to process that, right?
He had to get there. And so
But he did.
Anecdotally, yes, he did. Anecdotally, I've heard from physicians that that's more common than not. And so there's clearly some process that has to go through on the patient's end as well to be able to think about and access and have these kinds of discussions.
Well, it is, I think, from that patient perspective, and I'm going back again to just an N of one with my aunt who, went into the hospital, felt like it was flu-like symptoms, and basically found out it was cancer and died three days later. It was that progressed, and it was really bad. And subsequent to that, we've kind of found out through looking at her journal and different things, she had been having symptoms for months and months and months. But because of that, I think that psychological fear and that, death and all of that, just refused to even kind of acknowledge any of those symptoms and to go in and see a physician. And those are real pieces. We are human. And it's, as you said, we aren't necessarily built to be able to understand all of that and to be able to process our own emotions around that in a way that is beneficial for our long-term health and satisfaction and success.
Yeah. And I think that it's a real open question about whether it's beneficial to everyone to have advanced care planning discussions. If you don't want to talk about it, is there a benefit in me making you, or is it the best care for you to do what you think is best? And I think those are the kinds of questions we still have. Will we always be doing people a service to force them to take a look at their own mortality? Will that always end up, giving them a better perspective, or will that actually create greater undue stress? I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned about how do we approach the end of life, in the best way possible. And are there individual differences, and can we develop flexible approaches? And who knows what's best here? We know patients don't always know what's best for them. So do we let them lead or not? And so these are all the open questions that I think exist.
I'll tell you what, I want to make sure that the discussions are happening in the doctor's offices and not in the attorney's offices. I mean, I filled out my healthcare directive a couple of years ago, the first time, and it was in a lawyer's office. It wasn't even with a physician. It was the checklist that an attorney handed over to me and said, check, just work through this. And I didn't even think about it until after the document was finalized that shouldn't I be having this discussion with a physician? Shouldn't I actually be talking to a doctor rather than a lawyer about this? It seemed crazy. Yeah,
and it's interesting. I'm not sure that physicians do that much better. Because there's real bias in how you frame those choices. We've had a couple experiences. My dad would be hospitalized. He didn't fill out an advance directive. And, they would say, do you want us to save your life if your heart stops? And say, oh yeah, that sounds good. And then someone would come in and say, do you want us to pound on your chest and break your ribs in an attempt to bring you back to health? And then he was like, no, I don't want that. And I'm like, you're talking about the same thing, So it matters how you describe it, all of the framing effects there. So it's, I don't know what the optimal version of that would be, because clearly, again, a physician has a bias. Like, some of them think it's a terrible quality of life after CPR for someone who's terminally ill, and other people think we should do this all the time. And how the way you word the question is going to influence the response you get. And is that any better? Now that you have the response, but it was framed, you chose X response because it was framed one way. Have we made an improvement? I don't think so.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Well, this has been a terrific discussion, Victoria, for a whole bunch of reasons. One, it's just really great being in touch and connecting with you on this topic, and I think it's really great that you share your observations with our listeners. Thank you for that.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity. I appreciate it. It's I haven't done a lot of work in this area yet, but I have a lot of strong feelings about what needs to be done, and doors that are open. So it's fun to be able to talk about that and think about where we could go as researchers.
Yeah, I think it's an important component, as we said. It's these are decisions that have a tangible impact on not only quality of life, but also life and death in some instances. And so, it's an area that definitely needs to be studied more and to be taken seriously. So thank you for your work, and thanks for sharing.
Yeah, well, and it was fun to talk to you guys. You guys make this really easy, so I appreciate it. And Kurt, it was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you after all these. I mean, I literally have heard your name for 10 plus years and all the great stuff. So
thank you, guys.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our Behavioral Grooves interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our bad at predicting the future brains.
Yeah, that's all of us.
We are horrible at it.
That's not what humans are built for.
But it should be. I mean, evolutionary, we should be able to predict the future because that informs what we need to do today in order to survive. Wouldn't you think?
Should? Where are you getting this should? No, it's about just now. Like, feed me now, sleep now, mate now, not mate tomorrow. Mate now. Give me food now. Give me sleep now. Give me shelter now.
All right. So what do you think about that?
About sleeping now?
Well, I think that's what our listeners are hoping to do right now after what we're talking about. But no, what about this idea that we are not good at predicting the future or our own happiness or really...
Yeah, which is tied into motivation then as well, right? Big blind spots. And Victoria... just teed those up. We could do an hour just on how bad we are at knowing our own motivations, understanding our own happiness, and predicting the future.
Oh my gosh.
Actually, an hour on each of those, probably.
Multiple hours, probably.
Yeah. So I want to start just by noting that her work with Scott Jeffrey on the incentive stuff is just some of the greatest examples in there about how we believe that money is going to be the best motivator for us, but of course it's not.
It isn't.
It is just not even close.
In those situations that are those short-term incentives,
yeah.
various different pieces, money is important. We understand that money actually does motivate, but it doesn't motivate to the impact and to the level that the non-cash is in those experiments. And you've seen that, and you've seen that
lots and lots of times. And this is when money is okay, right? When you're making enough money to get by, right? Mm-hmm. Then the incentive is really just the sugar on the cereal, and that should and the best incentives are non-monetary.
Okay.
So I just wanted to note that, and I was really glad to go back to that because that's some of the work that I did with Victoria. You know, we were looking at incentives and goal setting and stuff like that.
So with that inability or our not so good ability to predict the future and our happiness in that, what are some of the ramifications for that? What are some of the things as we're thinking through beyond, maybe incentives and beyond end of life care? What are some of the aspects that poor predictability, our poor ability to predict impacts?
So the first thing that comes to my mind is when I think about my career. If I'm thinking about I've got a job in a big company and I'm eyeing the next job, the next level up, whatever that is, and I just get snapshots of that. I really don't, I don't have a big picture. I just get snapshots of seeing people. And so then I start to construe the story of, well, this is what that job must be like. And so I want it. But those snapshots are like little descriptors. They're not really the narrative as Victoria would talk about, right? It's not the story of what that job is really like on a day-to-day basis.
Which is actually the other part that I found fascinating from this conversation is her looking at the side effects and talking about how you frame those and do you use a narrative in order to tell that?
Yeah.
Because again, to your point, we are really bad at predicting the future and our ability to translate, sores in your mouth to what sores in your mouth actually means from a day-to-day living component. Our brains aren't wired to be able to just take sores in my mouth means I might not be able to eat, which would be painful and horrid and all these other things to, it's sores in my mouth. And a lot of that is because there's uncertainty about it. But I think a lot of it also comes into our lack of ability to have a future predicting mind.
And Victoria's example about, saying, okay, sores in your mouth could mean this, because here's someone who got sores in their mouth so badly that for weeks they were just eating through a straw because it was much too painful for them to actually chew food and swallow food. I'm like, okay, so that's different than just you're going to get sores in your mouth. That's a very different. The descriptor versus the story or the narrative, it makes a big difference. And so I'm saying in a career perspective, we get these little descriptors, these snapshots. You see super cool Joe standing up in front of the conference room making this great presentation, and you go, I want that job. That's cool.
Right. Those podcasters who are doing that awesome podcast called Behavioral Grooves, and wow, wouldn't that be a great job to have?
Everybody wants to be a podcaster.
But you don't understand the hours that go into the research, the setting up of the interviews, the background,
traffic that I ran into coming to the studio today,
editing that you do all of the time.
We don't think about that because we don't have the story behind it.
We don't have that narrative.
Yeah,
I think about that. We do work around communicating incentive plans, and it might be your quarterly or your annual incentive plan. And again, like that. The element of sores in your mouth, we typically just say, here is your plan. Here are the
descriptors, right?
It's the descriptors. Here is, if you reach goal, you will get X. If you're 5% over goal, you'll get X times, whatever that rate is.
Mm-hmm. So you got all the knowledge, right?
You have all of the knowledge.
The information is there.
But I think people have a hard time translating, and this isn't necessarily about future predicting, but it's about so what? How does that? What do I need to do now? And taking those descriptors and applying it back into what you're doing. So we have done work where we've actually done this with a few clients, where instead of just having plain boring stats and figures up there, we create a persona. We create Jana, who Jana is a rep, and she is this, typically falls within the top, 30% of people. But wow, with this new incentive plan, here is what Jana is going to do, or this is Jana's story. And we actually do it from a first person sometimes.
Okay.
Bringing that narrative in, which all of a sudden makes that, I am now having product B is 30% of my incentive plan. Well, what does that mean? Well, now, having that story of Jana and talking about, wow, with product B, I'm going to have to look at different clients, and I'm going to have to, set up my sales calls differently, and I'm going to have to do it. So it goes well beyond the incentive plan, but it goes into, what do you do? How does a rep use that incentive plan? And I think we don't do that enough, particularly in incentive plans, which I'm kind of really familiar with, but just in general, whenever there's a change coming across within an organization.
This is how your life might change.
This is how your life might change. And I think it gets into going back to some of the stuff that we heard at the University of Penn around norms. How can you set up the injunctive norm for what that future should be?
And describe it, right?
But because you're using a descriptive norm, even if it is a made-up person, by showing the actual components. And I don't know if that would actually be a real thing. I think that'd be interesting to hear back from any of those. If having a modeled person that isn't real, is that then become a descriptive norm, or is that an injunctive norm?
Okay,
we'll have to go back and ask Christina or Oregon.
But I think that's an interesting question, because we're talking about it, and Victoria has been talking about these narratives, taking just the descriptors of the future and turning them into narratives, are based on real people and real experiences, right? And then I loved that she brings up the most important question is, which are the stories that you're going to bring to the patient? What are the stories? So if we take it into our incentive world or our career world, what is the story that I'm going to give about this job? Or what is the story that's going to be about this persona acting or changing her behavior as a sales rep in order to reach her goals and achieve in the incentive?
And again, there's an ethical component to this.
Yes.
When she's talking about this, because you could create the narrative where it is so horrific, bring up those stories that nobody's going to do the procedure, or you could bring up the story that's so easy and well that everybody's going to do those stories. And so where's our obligation to have predict hope, or really, reality?
Or
and
reality.
That's a whole different piece.
Oh, yeah.
But going into, and those are, in those situations, sometimes life and death, sometimes, quality of life, definitely. But even there's an ethical component to think about, what is the story you tell around that sales incentive? Is it all, wonderful glory? Does Jana, always make, President's Club and everything else because of all this work
because
she
she's
does?
perfect, and so we want this story to be aspirational, to be in this perfection kind of a model, or is it better to paint a more realistic story?
Right, and
especially relative to me.
Right, and thinking about that mentor component, or you're looking to find out, hey, that's the job I want, and as the mentor, right? Right, mentee, mentor.
Yeah,
I'm getting them confused.
The mentee is the one who's being mentored.
Right. So as a mentor, what's the narrative I tell the mentee? Do I?
Right.
Because we often want to highlight the best of our lives. It's the Facebook, Instagram world that we live in, right? We don't show the shitty parts of our life.
Oh no,
we don't do that. And the same thing, I think, can happen in that mentor-mentee thing, where you don't talk about the hours of editing the podcast. You don't talk about getting stuck in traffic or trying to wow, we had, that guest who didn't show up and now we're scrambling to find something to fill in and the stress that goes out with that. Or, wow, Squadcast didn't, necessarily work this time. And how do we recover that audio that we just did that we're never going to be able to repeat? And wow, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. So,
well, I think back to this discussion of the narrative versus the snapshot or the descriptors. When I was in college, I was in LA and interviewed with the vice president of marketing for Columbia Records. And I was looking for an internship, but he was 2 hours late. And so I just sat in the waiting room, just waiting, and he finally comes in, and he's kind of bleary-eyed and looks pretty, 3 sheets to the wind still. And he said, "Oh yeah, I was at this, Bette Midler had a big party last night, and I got involved in this conversation with Sting that just took 2 hours, and there's a lot of cocaine and interesting." So these are just snapshots. It really wasn't a whole story of what his whole life was like or what his job was like. But those snapshots indicated to me, I don't want this job. I never want to do this job. I don't want to, I don't, that as sexy as he was trying to make it sound, it totally turned me off to the industry.
So Dan Gilbert has done a lot of work on this and about, predicting our future happiness and how bad we are at it. And he talks about the snapshot component. And one of the things that he said one time, and I'm going to totally mess this up, but he was talking about the idea of when we predict the future, we're to predict it to that level of specificity that we need. Did I say that word right?
It was close enough.
That's me, right?
We'll get it.
That's why you're here.
We have good listeners.
They understand that, if I'm looking out a year, to have that level of detail would take a year to think about that, because I got to think about, well, what happens then and then and then and then. So we end
which is crazy.
Which we end up fast forwarding. And we only slow down at certain spots. It's those snapshots that we take along the way. And so we're missing out on what life is really like.
Like going to the Eiffel Tower. All we're envisioning is standing in front of the Eiffel Tower on a beautiful sunny day and having our picture taken
with our family and everybody smiling and happy. And wow, isn't this
amazing? Yeah.
Isn't this a great component? We're missing, wow, it took us 2 hours in traffic, and wow, all these people around us and they're stinky, and we didn't get food before we left, and the kids are hungry. And it's crazy. And not saying that it's always going to necessarily be a negative on that. No. There could be things where we think that are bad and they actually turn out to be better. You break an arm or something, or you have some horrible tragedy happen, but then, wow, all these people that I haven't talked to in years reach out, and they're, and I rekindle these friendships that I had, and wow, I find all these wonderful, different community that I'm now a part of because of whatever happened to me.
And we don't anticipate all those things. And frankly, it's very difficult to anticipate those. And that's why it's great to have the story of this is what it was like from someone who has been through that or is living through that, so that you can say, well, what's your life like with the broken arm? Oh my gosh, it's been really great for reconnecting with all these friends. Oh, I didn't expect that would be part of it. So that's something that we can educate ourselves by talking to people who are living the future that we're anticipating.
Yeah, looking at those real life narratives of people who have gone through that experience. Now, granted, your experience is singular. It's going to be different. We are going to have unique aspects of it.
But we need not discount the experiences of others.
But it's that base rate, right? And again, we talk, Victoria talks about this in understanding the base rate versus an expert opinion.
Yeah.
And I thought, again, we could talk for hours on this. So how much of our worldview is informed by talking to an expert? Or talking to maybe not even an expert,
or relying on expert data.
Or relying on expert data, but not looking at the base rates for how things actually happen.
Right.
So going back, is somebody who broke their arm, are they an expert that we talk to, and they're an N of one, versus looking at the N of thousands of people who have their arm broken? And that's hard, and that's a difficult component, and it's not always readily available.
But we certainly could look at safety rates, driving your car versus flying in an airplane. we could certainly look at the risk of driving in a car is significantly higher than flying in an airplane because we've got the data on it.
And yet we know most people are more scared of flying in an airplane
That's right.
than they are of driving in a car. And yet we understand the base rates. It is much safer to fly than it is to drive.
Yeah. And again, vividness, availability bias, there's all kinds of things that are contributing to
control versus not control,
Yeah.
variety of different factors. Yeah. That being said, I think going back to something that Annie Duke said, do we want to live a life in that's based on what is real and what's the reality that's happening out there?
The Matrix or not the Matrix.
Right. And to a certain degree, I think we want to have that reality. We want to be based in this is the factual world that we're living in.
This is the question about hope.
But
right?
then
it gets back to Victoria.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are times, I think, in our life where maybe that reality isn't something that we actually want. We don't want to know that there's only a 12% chance of survival. We don't want to know that, hey, I am more likely to fail starting this business than succeed, because those are going to stop us from having hope. And I think hope is a really human element that is vital to us as being human. And I think that's something that we cannot discount. And so sometimes I think from a mere happiness, survival, quality of life, hope for the future, I think sometimes we just have to discount base rates.
Yeah.
I don't know when. I don't know how.
That's a complicated question, because I've been thinking about that since we talked to Victoria, and I don't have a clear perspective on that.
I don't think so. So listeners, if you do have a clear idea of that, please let us know. So
I got a music question for you.
No, you don't.
I
You
do.
never have music questions.
This is a super easy one, too.
All right.
Yeah, super easy. Like,
All
you're
right.
just going to answer this like instantly, right?
Okay, got it.
Okay. So I've read some research recently that the music that impacts us, that we take in between the time that we're 11 and 16.
11 and 16.
Yeah, years old. It's actually a little bit different for girls than it is for boys, slightly different, but let's just say that's the range. That leaves the biggest imprint on us, that we are more likely in general to go back to the music that impacted us and hit us between 11 and 16 than we are any other time in our life.
Okay.
So is that the case for you? That's first part one. And then part two is, then what is some of that music?
All right. So 1978 to 1983, I was probably listening to Van Halen, Black Sabbath, Ozzy Osbourne, Styx, my heavy metal phase. And to this day, I mean, I still listen to it, but it is not my go-to. It is not the one where I go back to.
It's not.
No.
You never. We've never talked about Ozzy Osbourne or Van Halen on the podcast. You talk about The Cure or
I go back to
Depeche Mode.
my college days, my later, from maybe a senior in high school, where I started to get into some of those, through college and even beyond those next few years, going back to grad school and various components after that. So yeah, I would disagree. I would say no.
It doesn't. That research isn't accurate for your life experience.
I fall outside of the parameters. I am a standard deviation or two from the norm in that, maybe.
Okay, good.
How about you? You're 11 to 16 year?
Because
it's right in the stuff that you talk about.
Absolutely. I learned how to play guitar when I was 11 years old. And so that music that I was listening to between 11 and 16 I listened to a lot. I listened to that stuff a lot, put lots of hours in. In fact, the summer that I was 13, I was playing guitar 4 or 5 hours every day.
Okay.
So I was learning those songs. I was experimenting with the instrument, and the music that I was listening to was absolutely connected to the effort that I was putting in. So I was doing some serious imprinting at that time.
So, but do you listen to that music today? Is it
I
still
do.
impactful for you?
Well, it's still my go-to. I shouldn't say my go-to, but it still has this very special emotional center for me, that when I'm looking for a particular emotional connection to part of me, music is that connector. It's the conduit, and that's the music that I go to.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I will still listen to, a Black Sabbath or an Ozzy Osbourne song or a Styx or something like that. And I do like that music, but it is definitely not a go-to. And I don't necessarily feel like there's an emotional connection that brings me back to that. Probably because it was, a 13-year-old sitting in a bedroom with an album, reading the back and being, downcast and 13-year-old. So, but not the memories that, I think of Depeche Mode, and I think of, being at a dance,
Interesting.
Dance where they're playing that music and it's going and there's these lights and people and it's fun and I don't know.
Okay. Well, you're outside the standard deviation.
I'm always outside the standard deviation.
With your booba mind that is so geeky on some things. Yeah.
All right. Well, listeners, thank you for listening, and hopefully you enjoyed this. If you did, as always, please go out, leave a review. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate just hearing from you as well. So send us a note, Twitter, LinkedIn, email. It's all in the show notes. So with that, thank you.